What's up guys, this is Tcg Sam here, and in today's video, I'm going to be talking about how I think each of these board breakers are going to fare in the current crossover breakers format. If you haven't already seen the video I did on hand traps, be sure to check that out. It's already up on the channel, but I figured if I posted one about hand traps, I should post one about board breakers as well, since these are almost equally as viable as hand traps in this format, and I think that's a pretty good thing. So without any further ado, let's get straight into it. Starting off with Harpy's Feather Duster, I think this card is probably just a potential side deck card. I don't think it's particularly good against any of the top 3 decks, being ryzeal, Fiendsmith variants, and Malice decks. I think against ryzeal, it could be okay. They would usually have like a cross on the field and maybe a few back row. That could be fine to trade with them, but it doesn't really deal with the biggest threats of the monsters on the board. And it's a similar idea against the Malice deck. Like, sure, they could have a few back row and you would force out the GWC trap early, but I don't think it really accomplishes much in terms of breaking the board. And finally, against the Fiendsmith deck, well, you could force out the Desiree maybe, but that's about it. So I think for that reason, it's probably just something you might put in your side deck. If you play Thrust or something, it could be a 1-of against those back row decks and probably be okay. But outside of that, I don't think it's really worth it. And before I continue, you're going to notice that I'm going to be essentially talking about these board breakers in the context of how they fare against the top 3 decks of ryzeal, Malice, and Fiendsmith variants. And I think that's because I feel like these decks are just going to be the most popular and the ones that you should be considering the most in your deck building. So that's why you're going to hear me talk about those a lot. Anyways, moving on to Book of Moon. I think this card is not very good in this format. 1-for-1 trading with a monster on the field is probably not great. Into ryzeal, yes, hypothetically it could trade with a detonator, but there's so many 1-for-1 trades with detonator out there that I just feel like there's better ones to consider playing. Now, Book of Eclipse, on the other hand, I think is a very good card this format. I would put it like at the top of potential main deck. The only reason I'm not putting it in main deck staple is because it doesn't really do anything against the Malice end board. So when you're going against the Malice end board of just Firewall, Terahertz, and like the trap card to bring back the White Binder, this card's not going to do anything. So it is dead in that matchup going second, but it is incredibly good against both the Fiendsmith decks and ryzeal decks. Being able to shut down essentially their entire field off of a single card is really powerful, and that's why I think this has so much more potential than Book of Moon, because those decks are going to put up more than one single threat on the field. Is really good into those decks because it does get around the fact that you can't use destruction type cards because of a card like Detonator. So I feel like if you're considering board breakers this format, then Book of Eclipse is probably one that you want to consider putting into your main deck. Next up is Cosmic Cyclone, and I think Cosmic Cyclone definitely fell off a lot from last format. I would say last format it was an incredibly powerful card that you would even consider main decking, but now I think it just falls to the potential side deck category. Going first, it isn't even that good anymore either, because none of these decks really have a super important field spell or continuous spell that they really need to resolve, aside from maybe Malice. But at that point, I feel like it's just not really worth it. Not to mention, going second, this card doesn't really do anything to break boards either, except against the Fiendsmith deck, where you would use it to remove the sequence of Crash to Desiree. But that being said, however, those decks that start to play a card like Agumday, and Agumday just gives them an extra equip on their fusion monsters, so a single Cosmic Cyclone doesn't even cut it anymore. So I feel like unless you are expecting a lot of back row decks, then this is something you would only potentially consider siding, and I don't think it's as nearly as good as it was in a previous format. Next up is Evenly Matched. I don't think this card's super crazy this format. It's maybe okay into a deck like Pure ryzeal and maybe the ryzeal Fiendsmith deck, because you would be able to trade with like Caesar, their cross, other back row cards, but you would still have to deal with the detonator on top, and I think that's the biggest problem on that board for the most part. And against the deck like Malice, they do have a spell trap negate with the Cyberus the Save Worm, and even if they didn't, they could resolve a single trap card, bring back White Binder, and just refill their entire board by banishing stuff from the graveyard. So even if it resolves against Malice and ryzeal, I don't think it's super great. Not to mention against Fiendsmith decks, they're either going to just end on Caesar and a bunch of hand traps, or Desiree, and Desiree just trades with this, so I don't think it's super great as well. Once again, it's going to go into the potential side deck category. Maybe there are some decks this is still really good against, and it could be a 1-of thrust target, but other than that, I don't think it has something that has a lot of value. Next up is Super Polymerization, and I think Super Polymerization is also something that is maybe not even worth talking about this format, but I will put it at potential side deck because this is just such a powerful card. Off the top of my head, there isn't like a super clear and obvious deck you want to use this against. all these decks have a lot of flexibility in what they can put up on their end board, and so I think that's going to mean it's really hard to find a good Super Poly target that's able to hit these decks consistently, especially if they know you're playing Super Poly, because then they can tailor their board to start playing around it. That being said though, like Evenly Matched, I think this card is still powerful enough to maybe consider side decking, but once again, I don't think it's a very great card into most of those top decks. Next up is Kashtira Fenrir, and I think that Fenrir, while it is fairly solid as a part of the Kashtira engine, because it does generate the extra body, gets advantage in hand, and it has maybe some potential uses as an end board piece or into some certain boards, I just feel like Fenrir as a standalone board breaker is just not that good this format. It's not really going to be doing enough into any of the boards out there. Maybe just a Fiendsmith board that only consists of like Wave High King Caesar, for example, and this is assuming they don't even have the Fiendsmith and Paradise Trap set up already on beforehand. I don't think this card is very good into the ryzeal deck either. You could hypothetically just summon it and go straight to battle phase and try to force out Detonator that way, but then they would just activate Cross and you wouldn't be able to do anything from there. So I really don't think this is going to be good against the ryzeal deck either. Against Malice, same idea. Like, it's not really doing anything. So I think that while it has a lot of potential and is very good in the Kashtira engine, as a board breaker, I wouldn't really consider playing it for the most part. Next up is Herald of the Abyss. This card's just not worth it. There's no towers monsters like Expertly Noir, so there's no reason to really play this card. Forbidden Droplet, I think, is probably the first one I'd consider putting in the main deck staple. Droplet is just such a powerful card and such a powerful form of interaction, making it so your opponent can't respond to it. Against ryzeal, it is pretty good at getting rid of the Detonator and the Wave High King Caesar end boards. I think this is pretty solid. You would still have to deal with like their non-engine and the Cross though, and maybe whatever Fiendsmith cards they have in the grave like Fiendsmith in Paradise. Against the Fiendsmith decks, it is pretty good as well. It can help you dodge your card like Desiree, and of course can deal with DDD Wave High King Caesar pretty well. And against Malice, I think it has a neat interaction where if your opponent uses GWC06 to bring back Whitebinder, you can actually droplet that, whereas a card like Infinite Impermanence wouldn't really work in that case, because assuming they would use the trap after you've already committed monsters to the board. So I feel like it is a card that's worth playing in your main deck if your deck can support the cost, but at the same time, I don't really feel like you have to play this in every single deck. If you were to play a board breaker though, I think this is probably one of the first ones you'd consider putting into your main deck. Similar idea with Triple Tactics Talents and Triple Tactics Thrust. I think there's still a fair number of hand traps going around this format, so I feel like these cards are worth playing. Thrust, especially post-siding, it allows you to build your side deck in a way where you don't have to commit that many cards to going first. You could side in like one copy of like Artifact Sanctum or like one copy of Dimensional Barrier, for example, and instead of siding like 3 and 3 if you weren't playing Thrust. But even going second Thrust as a board breaker, it can be really solid. Of course, grabbing Talents is really good into pretty much any one of the boards out there. And even grabbing a power spell like Ultimate Slayer as well could potentially be incredibly strong into those boards too. So I feel like Thrust is a very solid main deck staple, and Talents is also pretty good as well, because like I mentioned, there's still a bunch of hand traps running around, and going second, every single one of those boards is going to end up using a monster effect, and outside of Malice, they're not going to have an Omni Negate to be able to counter this. So I feel like these two cards are definitely main deck worthy cards that if you were to play board breakers, I definitely consider playing these. Next up is Pancratops. I think Pancratops is probably just a worse Fenrir, so I just put it in not worth. Same reasons as Fenrir, but just worse because it doesn't even keep the body on the board afterwards or generate more cards in the hand. Next up is Raigeki and Darkhole. I also think these cards are not worth it this format. Maybe you can argue against the Fiendsmith variants where they just end on like a Caesar, for example. Trading with Caesar is pretty solid, and there is really no way your opponent's going to be able to stop it, whereas there is really no way your opponent's going to be able to stop it versus a card like Eclipse where they could technically Ash Blossom it. But outside of that specific matchup, I don't think it's doing anything to ryzeal because of Detonator Protect. It's not really doing anything to Malice because they have a spell trap negate. Also, not to mention, they can use the GWC trap essentially anytime they want and just snowball super big advantage from there. So I feel like unless you're playing Tenpai specifically, these cards are just not worth it as board breakers. Next up is Change of Heart. And I feel like Change of Heart is probably the first card I'm going to put in side deck staple. I think this is a very solid card in this format. The reason being, it does all the things you want it to do in terms of a board breaker. Like, it deals with Detonator okay because it doesn't destroy it. It does do okay into Malice as well. It'll trade 1-for-1 with the Cyber's Disave Worm, or if you are able to bait out the Disave Worm, you're able to take the Terahertz, which is a big body, plus deny them the pack bit. And against the Fiendsmith decks, I think in particular, taking DDD Wave Hiking Caesar is a very strong interaction. You're able to stop a card like Lacrima or force it out early, and that means you're able to force out a Lacrima early, and you're able to protect yourself a little bit from cards like Nibiru. So I feel like it's a pretty solid board breaker. I think this is a card that does have some potential because of that very specific interaction it has with DDD Wave Hiking Caesar. Next up is Forbidden Chalice, and I actually personally quite like Forbidden Chalice's format. It also deals with Detonator pretty well. It's able to deal with the problem cards you needed to, like DDD Wave Hiking Caesar, and against the Malice deck in particular, you're able to stop Whitebinder when it comes out onto the board during your turn, because once again, like Droplet, your opponent will probably only use that card after you've committed cards to the field, so you can't imperm, whereas something like Chalice would still work in that case. So I feel like as a board breaker, this card is fine. Going first, of course, it has great applications as well, and it's just the extra copy of Infinite Impermanence that your opponent is unlikely to be able to cross out Designator. Going first, going second, this card is good enough to be considered to be played in your main deck, in my opinion. Next up is Metaltronus, and I think Metaltronus is a very interesting card. Off the top of my head, I can only really think of one like kind of interesting target, and that would be Underworld Goddess. And the reason I'm saying that is because it is a light monster with 3000 attack, and ryzeal Detonator is a light monster with 3000 attack. So I think something cool you can do is activate Metaltronus on the Detonator, summon out a Underworld Goddess, and then turn that into a Fiendsmith combo because it is a light fiend. And I feel like that's one interaction is the only reason I'm really considering this card. I don't think it's super great into any of the other boards out there. It is a very conditional 1-for-1 outside of the case that I mentioned with the Underworld Goddess. So I feel like maybe if your deck can take advantage of that interaction, it could be good. But if your deck isn't able to take advantage of that, then I feel like it's just something that isn't really worth playing, in my opinion. But maybe there's some crazy target that we all haven't thought of yet that could be good into the meta decks right now. Next up is Ultimate Slayer. I think this is still a side deck staple, even though ryzeal boards have been changing quite a bit now and are no longer just Detonator and Cross Pass. I still feel like this could be really solid into the ryzeal end board, because you could spin something like the Detonator or the DDD Wave Hiking Caesar, for example, and then use the Mirror Logic Aggregator to negate the other one, and that would deal with two of the XCs, which are the biggest threats on that end board. Not to mention against Malice, it could potentially be decent as well to be able to shuffle away the Terahertz. And then if you play a card like Tri-Brigade Bucephalus, it can send Garura to draw a card. And then against the Fiendsmith variants, so I feel like the fact that it's still pretty good against ryzeal and okay into the other two makes it so I would consider putting it into my side deck. I definitely would say it's nowhere near as crazy as I think some people thought it would be, because ryzeal decks have been adapting pretty well. But that being said, though, I still think Ultimate Slayer is a pretty solid card that I would definitely consider siding. Next up, we're getting to like the tribute monsters. I think that Kaijus are just not really good this format. The only like 1-for-1 trade I feel really good about, I guess, with a Kaiju is on the Firewall Dragon Terahertz, because you're essentially taking away the Spell Trap Negate and the other effect to send Packbait on your turn. But outside of that, I just feel like there are better 1-for-1s out there. Lava Golem, on the other hand, I feel like is something that has a little bit more potential. It is able to potentially deal with the ryzeal end boards pretty well, because they're never really just ending on a single copy of Detonator. It's usually Detonator plus like Wave Hiking Caesar, and then against Fiendsmith and Malice, they may have multiple bodies on their end board as well. But that being said, though, I think this is still a very risky card to play. All of these decks could hypothetically end on boards that all play around this, so I feel like if this suddenly becomes a little bit more popular, it's probably going to end up falling off as people start tailoring their end boards to play around this card. And then Sphere Mode, I think, is in a similar boat as the Kaijus. This card just isn't that good. I don't think there's any deck that's really ending on 3 really big threats that you need to deal with on their end board that would force you to play a card like Sphere Mode. I think that's one thing about these in this format. There aren't really any Omni-Negates in this format outside of maybe the Cyrus the Save Worm, if you count that. Like, all these other board breakers should be able to play through whatever boards are being put up, at least in some way. So I feel like these are just not really needed in this format, but out of these 3, I feel like Lava Golem is probably the one with maybe the most potential, but still isn't super great. Next up is Dark Ruler. I think Dark Ruler is also just a potential side deck card. I think it could potentially be like a Book of Eclipse against ryzeal. Could be fairly solid. Your opponent should really have no way to beat this. And Against a deck like Malice, it maybe trades 1 for 1. Against a deck like Pure Fiendsmith, maybe trades 1 for 2 if they have like an extra cash monster on board plus like a DD Wave Hiking Caesar. That could be decent, but I just feel like it's a way less flexible version of Book of Eclipse in that case. So at the end of the day, I think you would rather choose Book of Eclipse because it does have applications going first, and it can help in some more niche situations that Dark Ruler isn't able to help you in. Next up is Enemy Controller. I think this card's also something with maybe potential this format. I've seen some people starting to experiment with it, and I think it could be a decent card. If your opponent uses something like Book of Eclipse against you, this could be decent because now it gives you some value to your set monsters. Going second, it can help you dodge targeting effects, which can be nice, but I feel like your deck has to be able to take full advantage of the monster that you're stealing in order for it to be really good. It can be really solid in some mirror matches, like if you're able to take like a key monster like ryzeal Detonator, or if you're able to take a key monster like Firewall Dragon Terahertz. But I feel like for the most part, this is probably just something that would need more experimenting, and maybe it can find the right home in this very specific deck. Next up is Lightning Storm. I think Lightning Storm is probably something that has the potential to be side decked. It has some flexibility to be able to hit back row, but it also suffers the same problems as Raigeki and Darkhole. Like, just mass monster destruction just isn't that good in this format in my opinion. But because it does have the ability to hit spells and traps, it might be useful in some other matchups. Finally, we have Kurikara. In theory, all these end boards are going to have monsters that are going to use their effects and then are just going to stay on the board afterwards and still be relatively threatening. If you think of cards like Detonator and cards like Wave Hiking Caesar, these are cards that will still be threatening after they use their effect the first time, so maybe it could be worth it in that situation. But I think the problem is, against those decks, they're actually always going to have a card like Fiendsmith and Paradise in the graveyard, and that just instantly outs the Kurikara. So I don't feel like you can really take full advantage of the fact that you get a body on board that's able to rob something during the end phase. But maybe in some niche situations against ryzeal, you could like kill a Detonator, drop this, and then rob it on your turn and use the Detonator effect to attach one, and now you have a Detonator on your board. Could be kind of cool, but I don't really think this is a card that has too much potential unless maybe for some reason you're still playing Snake Eyes Ash and you're able to search this. So that's going to do it for this tier list. Let me know what you thought about it in the comment section below. I feel like for the most part, while board breakers are good, the good board breakers are really few and far between, but the fact that they can be used, I feel like is a really good sign for the format overall. I've seen people mixing hand traps and board breakers and seeing some decent success. There could be something that I'm missing with some of these board breakers, and there could be like a hidden gem in here somewhere. But let me know what you think about it in the comment section below. Are you playing board breakers in your deck this format, or are you sticking with hand traps? With all that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.